I'm very pleased to introduce Andrew Gunther, who is the Program Director at Animal Welfare Approved, who will be introducing our keynote speaker for tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. No, yeah. I'm the short English guy that sort of gets everything very, very wrong most of the time. I just like to start with a sort of very humbling space, what a privilege it is for AWA to be here, and me in particular to be in one of the greatest seats of learning, not just in America, but I think across the globe. And to be talking about a subject that's particularly dear to my heart, where we work with farmers who are trying to promote a farming practice, and labeling is something that's crucial to them. And I think Urvashi will talk about that a little bit later, and we'll talk about it a lot more tomorrow. But I think, thank you to the speakers. I considered myself before this morning somewhat of an expert on labeling and food labeling and what a train wreck it was in food animal production. I've now concluded it's an even bigger train wreck in other places and something that needs fixing. But this isn't about me, and it's not about AWA. It's about a lady that I've had the privilege to know about for many, many years, and she's been working in this industry for 14 years, so she's now, I think, about 31, is it? Urvashi Rangan, Dr. Urvashi Rangan, has been working in food labeling for 14 years with the Union Consumers Reports and in various ways, and something called the greenerchoices.org. And what is unique is they put together a rating system where you can, as a consumer, as an interested person, as an academic, look at what's behind the label. And they took some really key issues around that in terms of the integrity of the label, who owns the label, and let's talk about the label and made that public knowledge. But beyond that, Urvashi's one of those voices where I would say if you want to know about meat labeling, I'm a person that can talk about meat labeling, and if you want to learn about other forms of labeling, you can talk to other folks. Urvashi encompasses all of us, but she looks at it from both sides. She looks at it from the producer and she looks at it from the consumer. And not just that, she has an unerring quality to make what she says understandable, to make it cognizant for all of us and readable in a way we can get it. So a little background. Started at Johns Hopkins. I'm sorry it wasn't Harvard, but she did start at Johns Hopkins, and they seem to be a great school for human health and other issues. Worked her way through various areas, and I think she's worked with a number of folks in the room. But a little anecdote from home. If you ever get the privilege, and I haven't had it yet, but apparently one day I will be privileged to eat at Urvashi's house. We pass at conferences and conference dinners, and I enjoy my conference dinners more than Urvashi does. The 80 pounds extra weight will tell you how much I enjoy my food. She has a chalkboard in her kitchen, and on this chalkboard, and I know this because people have told me, are the ingredients for the food that her family are going to eat that evening when she's there, where they've come from and what's in it. And then she rewards her children by making positive choices. So Urvashi doesn't just think about food at work, she thinks about food at home too. But I think what she's speaking to there is education. And I think every one of the panelists today talked about education. And as much as there was some differing opinions at the end of that panel, even Coca-Cola agreed we need to educate our consumers. And you as the next group of experts, as the next group of attorneys, food nutrition experts, can help educate the next group of children. So what Urvashi's going to do this evening is just sort of take us through where consumer reports are with labeling and some of the ideas that she has for, as she puts it, modern labels, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and why we need them. So with no further ado, Urvashi Rangan, Consumer Reports. Thank you, ma'am.
Hi, Andrew. Thank you. Good evening. You can hear me all okay on that? All right, great. So thank you so much. Thank you, Harvard. And I'm so excited to talk to this group of people. I'll just say right off the bat, I think the way we change this landscape is by getting people in the room who have a lot of different skill sets. I'm a scientist, but I love sitting with the lawyers because that's the only way we actually start to turn this cube over and over and figure out what the solutions are. So I'm going to take you through kind of what a day in my life looks like and the last 14 years have looked like. I'm an environmental health scientist. I do a lot at Consumer Reports, but labeling is the thing I get the most questions on. I do the most media on. A carton of eggs and all the labels and what they mean is news every single year for every morning show. And it's something we need to get our heads around in terms of what's meaningful, what's not, and trying to kind of clear the marketplace of all the green noise out there. And that's really our goal at Consumer Reports, is to help move that landscape. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why we need credible labels, because once I get into this story, it's a little bit depressing and it's a little bit gloom and doom, but I want to start out with why we actually need to fight for better labels in the marketplace. The first thing is that we need to create a market demand for sustainable practices, and that's what labels can do. We can actually encourage consumers, to the degree they're credible, to start creating a market demand and a market pressure for something that's better than the baseline. And that's actually one of our real interests in this, is in moving the market toward a more sustainable system. We think credible labels are actually a great tool to do that. We also think it gives consumers the opportunity to make value-added purchasing decisions at the point of purchase. That's a really powerful tool. And especially for the mass market, when you're in a store versus a farmer's market, there's no one to talk to about that product. There's nowhere to who's going to tell you anything more about that product. So labels are really important for the mainstream and for the marketplace. And consumers want to know that if they pay more, that they're going to get a product that meets their expectations. And environment, health, safety, these are all reasons consumers look for value-added labels on food. Health is the most important. Health registers #1 every single time in these polls. That's why consumers are looking to these labels. That doesn't mean they don't care about the other things, but people tend to care about their personal health, their family health first, and they make decisions based on that. Okay. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about what we do at Consumer Reports, because we're not just your dad's bathroom reading. We actually do a lot of things. We've been around since 1936. I run our consumer safety group, so I do everything from toilet bowl cleaner safety to food safety to auto car seat safety, and I get involved across the board. And I want to share that experience with you. We've been looking at labels on all sorts of products for a long time, from electronics to cleaning products to personal care products, and there's kind of a lot to learn when you see all those fields. Food is actually ahead of the game. I know it doesn't feel that way, but it kind of is. We have a Food Safety and Sustainability Center now at Consumer Reports, where our focus is to tie those two things together and educate the public on how, yes, we want a safer food system, but we don't want Band-Aid solutions at the end of the line. We actually want long-term systemic solutions in place, and that often requires a good look at sustainability. And it requires a look, as Mike Jacobson said, from a scientific perspective. There's a philosophy around it, but really how we fight this is from a scientific perspective, from a consumer expectation perspective, and that's really important to us. We want to educate people about meaningful labels, about the marketing traps, and about the underlying practices, because if you don't understand what the conventional baseline is, then it's really hard to figure out if that label is giving you any added value. So we feed arsenic, to a lot of poultry animals, but a lot of people don't know that. The fact of the matter is, groups like Animal Welfare Approved or Organic don't allow that. But unless you talk about those things, you're not going to say, oh yeah, those labels don't feed them arsenic, because no one in their right mind would actually think we feed animals arsenic in order to promote their growth. So it's really important, despite how preposterous they may seem, to constantly educate the public about the baseline. I came to Consumer Reports 14 years ago to develop criteria for them to rate these labels, as Andrew was talking about. Michael Crupain, my colleague, is going to be talking about it on the last panel tomorrow and getting a little more into the detail of all of our criteria that we use. But suffice to say, we think it should be meaningful. We think labels should be verified. They should be consistent in meaning. They should be transparent. And they should be independent to the degree they can be. But they should have input from a wide variety of stakeholders to make the best decisions about what those standards should be. We watchdog those standards as well. So we spend a lot of time at National Organic Standards Board meetings. We do a lot of lobbying of the government for better improvements. We file petitions, we file complaints. We've testified to Congress and the agencies on better labeling practices and greenwashing in the marketplace, and what really needs to be done to kind of get rid of this nonsense so we can kind of get on and create a marketplace where credible labels can actually compete effectively with one another. They can't do that right now because there's a lot of noise, there's a lot of crappy labels out there. So like I said, we file complaints, we attend hearings on label standards. We've actually even introduced legislation. I'll talk a little bit more about California and the organic label on fish and how we stop the sale of that there until the feds come up with some standards. And we do a lot of surveys. We have a national research center, and we can actually do national polls in a moment's notice, and we can also plan and do more long-term polls. And it's a really great way to call what consumers expect from labels, what they think they mean, what they're willing to pay more for in the store. And those are always really important pieces of information that we take with us to lobby for better changes and policies. So this is the group that's here today, and I just thought it would be really nice to illustrate that there are so many intersections between what we do. And while we all have sort of expertise in different areas, I think the intersections are really fascinating. And just from the perspective of food safety, it involves all of us in there, even in terms of sustainability and what that means. California Proposition 65, is everyone familiar with that program? So that's pretty interesting too, because it's not necessarily, it's a illegal-based program where if you exceed a certain threshold of an ingredient or something in a product that is known to the state of California to cause a reproductive harm or cancer, you've got to label it that way. You have to say this product contains something known to the state of California to cause that. And that's a very, very interesting law out there, and there isn't anything that exists quite like it, and yet it is something that can actually move the country a lot of the time, because if California starts to list it, like they have, for example, with some ingredients in caramel color, so the nation starts to go. So it's very interesting. And the precautionary principle is also in there. And I want to talk a little bit about that. I mean, I think some people think, oh, if you don't know, then you shouldn't do that, and that's what precaution is. And I think it's not quite that simple. I think it's when you have, science is almost never certain. And so what do you do in the face of uncertainty? When we have animal studies that show harm, and I hear in the news, oh, it's an animal study, it's not a human being. Well, it would be unethical to actually test a lot of these things on human beings. So to the degree we are trying to assess safety and understand what that is, we do use the animal models to start to get a look at that. Epidemiology makes associative links, not causal links. And so you have to kind of look at the layers of science and information in order to really get the prism of what's going on. But to the degree you get that prism and you can start making sense of some of the troubles, then we ask, is that an unnecessary risk? Are there alternatives? We did a lot in the bisphenol A debate around the plastics, and frankly, we don't think people should eat it. Fine, you can build a headlight with polycarbonate plastic, but to the degree it's in can liners and they're heating that up and it's leaching into the food, and we've got hundreds of studies showing harm, including human associations, frankly, we don't think people should have to eat it. People shouldn't have to be the guinea pigs in that equation. In terms of right to know, we think consumers do have a right to know about how their food's produced, and poll after poll shows us that consumers want to know more and more about that. Organic, and I'm going to talk a lot about organic a little bit later, but that is a federal program under the Organic Food Production Act, and is really at the nexus of all of this. We get into some pretty crazy discussions twice a year at the public meetings. It's scientists, it's lawyers, it's the industry, and it's a really fascinating intersection that goes on in the conversations that go on about what's a natural substance, what's synthetic. It's actually not very well defined, and it's a really big problem when it comes to nailing things down and making clean lines. And that's an area we can all help with, actually, and we can all make that better. And certainly in terms of marketing and advertising, general claims that are on the market, we have some laws that underlie things, and we've heard today a little bit about preventing misleading and deceptive advertising. It's a great goal. And a lot of the agencies hold that as a goal. And yet that is not what we're seeing in the marketplace. So where's the disconnect? So I'm going to take you through a little bit of that and talk about that disconnect, and maybe are we enforcing that to the degree we should be? I think that's something we should all be thinking about in this room. So let's start with the good, because we're going to go down from here. And basically, this is just an example of an animal production system. And these are not necessarily the exact concentric circle labels, but it gives you an idea of how there's a spectrum of sustainability. And you can move the market incrementally by saying, yeah, if you use labels that say no antibiotics used, you didn't feed them to healthy animals, that's something. That's better than the conventional baseline. But what does that mean in the context of what's really sustainable? And that's a challenge for us, is how do we educate people depending on where they are on this spectrum? So what you'll see is organic kind of stops at that third circle. It's not what many people think necessarily. Natural is below all the circles. American grass-fed starts to get a little bit wider, and animal welfare approved, frankly, starts to take on a bigger chunk of that pie. But all of these things are important, and to the degree we move this market along that spectrum of sustainability, we think all those things offer value to consumers. Okay, so our philosophy is bad labels are usually not a mistake. And to the degree that this market exploits the use of labeling to sell a product, because that's what we live in a capitalist society, and that's the goal, we sometimes find that there are things that result from that don't necessarily serve consumers or the marketplace. We think there are a lot of maneuvers to undermine truthful and non-deceptive business practices. FTC Act Section 5 is supposed to provide the entire basis for how we market things and preventing deceptive business practices. And as we heard earlier today, FDA has a similar edict in terms of preventing misleading and deceptive labeling. But there's a lot of ways to cheat that, and I'm going to talk about specific examples in a minute. There is a tension between special interest and public interest. Let's just put that on the table, and then to the degree we have to dialogue about that and talk about what makes sense from a scientific perspective, from a consumer expectation perspective, let's have that dialogue. But that is the tension out there, and it's something we all have to deal with. Here's where we start to get to the catch. So when an agency regulates and they sort of have one foot in the door, so hypoallergenic and natural, for the sake of argument, both of those fall under the jurisdiction of the FDA. They regulate that claim on a lot of food products. They regulate those claims on personal care products. There isn't a definition of what they mean. So to the degree of protecting First Amendment rights, free speech, why should you be able to use a claim that doesn't mean anything? Is that free speech? I think that's misleading. I think it's deceptive. And I think we see these claims all the time. And so something is not connecting between preventing deceptive business practices and putting through misleading and potentially deceptive labels on the market. And there's a real disconnect. And I'll talk a little bit more about hypoallergenic and natural and sort of what went wrong with those in a minute. So how do we create a better market? We need the government to set minimum requirements for using labels. We need them to be truthful, transparent, and trustworthy. We don't think that exists right now. We need to educate consumers about the underlying production practices. We talked about that. It's a really powerful way to shift demand. That's not a regulatory one necessarily. We need to police labels in the marketplace. We need to go out there, we need to look at the labels that are misleading, and we need to file complaint after complaint after complaint until it actually gets heard somewhere and it gets addressed. And we need to expose loopholes in regulations, and this is where a lot of you in the room come in, that block meaningful labeling and actually encourage vague and misleading labeling, and there's a lot of those. And I'm a scientist. I'm not an expert at reading legal language, but frankly, that's where a lot of the traps lie, and to the degree we can fix those, find other things that show precedents to do a better job, we need to be doing those things. And we need to bring the bottom up, and we need to make the top taller. And what I mean by that is we have some really terrible conventional baseline practices that go on. So part of our goal in pushing people toward buying these labels is to bring the bottom up. So to the degree we're seeing legislation on getting around antibiotic use, at least medically important to human drugs, and trying to curtail that to some degree, that is what these sustainable labels have started to do. You're starting to pull the bottom up, and we think that's a great thing. But the labels themselves have to grow over time too, or else they become obsolete over time. A great example of a label called NutriClean that was out about a decade ago. It was meant that a piece of produce couldn't have any less than 1 ppm of a pesticide residue. But then EPA started setting thresholds that were actually lower than that. And so it became meaningless over time because they never advanced that standard over time. And so to the degree that labels also need to improve in order to keep their integrity while the bottom's coming up, it's a dynamic landscape, and that's what needs to happen, and it needs to go in that direction, not in the other one. Okay, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide because I feel like this was covered earlier, but there are lots of ways to get a label. There are self-proclaimed unverified labels. So as a company, I can make any claim I want to, really, on a package. I can put natural on there, and I pretty much don't have to mean anything by it. I can put hypoallergenic on there, and that doesn't mean it's more sensitive for your skin. It can mean whatever the company wants it to mean. There's no consistency in those labels from product to product. So those are sort of, you know, the red flag kind of labels out there. We call them general claims. There can be very few standards, very little verification, and it really clouds the landscape out there. It really adds to the green noise. Obviously, there's regulatory guidance. There are practice guidelines. Prop 65 sort of gets at that. And even Federal Trade Commission's green guides are their interpretation of their authority in terms of preventing deceptive business practices. And they give a lot of examples of what they think are deceptive. So to that degree, those things are very useful for the market. Substantial transformation, I want to talk about that a little bit. It's how an additive is required to be labeled on a package. And FDA has their own definition of substantial transformation. It's also being argued at the WTO under COOL what that means, which may be a little bit different. But to the degree it imparts a chemical change, an organoleptic change, it tastes different, you have to actually label it. But there are a lot of things that you would hope would be labeled under that you might think would substantially transform something, but it isn't required. And I think the biggest one of the day and the biggest elephant in the room is genetic engineering, because the argument is it doesn't really substantially transform the food. Yet that seed did not originate from nature. It was substantially transformed from nature in order to get that seed. So why is it if you smoke something, that's substantial transformation, or you homogenize it, or you pasteurize it, or you don't do any of those things, you have to label it? It seems preposterous if you genetically engineer it that you shouldn't have to label it. So that's sort of the... bravo, yeah. So substantial transformation is a key in understanding and really pressing. Irradiated meat, about 10 years ago, there was a fair amount of irradiated meat on the market, and the American Meat Institute fought hard to get that off of the meat labels. And we fought them hard, saying, no, consumers want to know about that. We did polls taking consumer sentiment about that. Consumers chose not to buy it, but that was at least a consumer choice that they were able to make because they were informed by something on the package. And to that degree, why shouldn't consumers have the right to make those choices? They should. And irradiation does cause substantial transformation in the meat. It's actually why it's required for meat and how they got around labeling it for spices and fruits and other things where they say there's not one. So it's an interesting fork in the road. There are private label certifications. We've heard about them earlier. Animal welfare approved is an example of one of them. And you know, it's really interesting because I think to the degree the market wants to innovate, private labels can provide a really fast way to get there. And so there is a real advantage to having these private certification programs, but again, kind of under the criteria we were talking about before, how we rate these labels, we want them all to meet that. But we're very open to any which way you get to a label. There's benefits to having it be regulatory, there's benefits to having the organic program be public, but there are benefits to having private certification label schemes. And in many cases, you can get to higher standards faster. And public label is organic's an example of that. There are also accreditation programs. So the USDA actually acts as an accreditor to certification bodies around the country. They accredit certifiers to then certify organic food. It's just an important link because there are some groups that sound like labels. Marine Stewardship Council, for example, they're not a label. They're a label, but they're the accreditor who's going to accredit a certifying body to actually do the work. And the government is also considering those systems as well for food safety inspection, for a lot of other things, third-party accredited kind of certification systems. Okay, so I'm going to take you through a few little sort of real case studies. But the first thing I want to ask is this: has anybody heard of that label? Wicked Local? Yeah. I made it up. I mean, maybe it exists, but I totally made it up. And I could stick it on anything I wanted to and sell it. I could do that because nothing's stopping me from doing that. Yeah. That's great. I knew I should use the Wicked, but I didn't know if it would actually end up anywhere. All right, so that's how easy it is. I gave a TED Talk on this last year, and I had a big green T, and I felt like I couldn't bring that to Boston because you've seen that label before. Another funny little instance, this is where Wonder Bread actually claimed that the bread that they had with added calcium could actually help brain function. And we saw a lot of great examples today of sort of really pumping up the health benefits of a product. FTC took them down on this. They were not allowed to continue with this. And there's an example of where things are working, where we get enforcement, we finally get some traction, we get movement, and we get things changed. Another example is rayon made from bamboo. Did anyone follow that case at all? It's called the bamboozled case. And FTC actually started following up on that. Here's what the rub was on this. Rayon is made from collagen. I mean, you can take, or cellulose, you can take any fiber and you can make rayon out of it, and you have to use a hell of a lot of chemicals to do it, and it's a highly synthetic product. It is no longer the natural product that it was. And so FTC actually ruled that you could not make this assertion that rayon clothes were made from bamboo. That it was not bamboo anymore. It was such a highly synthetic thing in the end. It was a synthetic material. And so there's some hope out there that actually we can enforce these things and we can prevent some misleading practices from going on. So I don't know if you all can see that. It's how little it can take to be a label or how to regulate and not regulate at the same time, because I think we live in that dichotomy and it's really troubling. And to the degree we can sort of untangle ourselves from that, I think we'll get a lot more clarity in the marketplace. We've talked about FTC's Act Section 5, preventing deceptive and misleading business practices, and yet natural. So natural we talked about on regular food, it doesn't have to mean anything. We've heard about some class action suits that have gone on around natural because there's no standard. So to the degree you or I or anyone feels deceived by that and wants to file a complaint with the FDA, what do they have to enforce to? Nothing. So it lives in limbo and is used in the marketplace ad nauseum, but really it shouldn't be. We think that label actually should just be banned altogether. It's a really misleading label. It does a huge disservice to moving the marketplace towards sustainability. And people actually think natural means more than organic, and it's shocking. And I've spent 14 years at Consumer Reports, and we stick it in every story that we can, and lots of people educate on that, and yet consumers still think sometimes, or at least the majority think natural means more than organic. For USDA, it means nothing artificial was added to the cut of meat itself. It has nothing to do with how the animal was raised, what it ate, if it was on drugs its whole life, if its tail was docked. It has nothing to do with that. It didn't have to see the light of day, and it could be labeled as natural. That's not what consumers think natural means, and that doesn't meet consumer expectations, and yet we see this label all over the place. Then USDA came out and they wanted to propose naturally raised. It's like, good God, you already have a bad natural label, and now why do you want to propose another natural label out there? And that's going to completely confuse people. So they did a proposed rule for this, and it was meant for the consumer market, and it was going to mean actually something pretty legitimate: no antibiotics, no growth hormones, and no animal byproducts. Okay, that's all of those things are legitimate and they're value added. Why not just say that? Because that's not what that necessarily means. And when we polled consumers about that, the majority told us that's not what they expected it to mean. They think that means the animal could exhibit natural behaviors. Maybe it ate natural feed. Maybe it led a natural life. It doesn't mean any of those things. So I will say I think it's positive we prevented, and with other groups, the USDA from moving this out into the consumer sector. They still use it on the supply side chain. But at least we'd rather have it kept there than be out on the consumer market. These are all other meat marketing claims. So when anyone who wants to put a claim on their meat package, what's required of them? They actually have to go through the Food Safety Inspection Service at USDA, and they have to actually give them an affidavit and send it in. And I think actually now it's going paperless. And USDA basically goes behind the door and decides, should they be able to use that? All right, that sounds good. Sure, great. Go ahead. And whether it's free range, cage free, and dozens of other meat marketing claims, that has been the process historically that's been used. There's a lot of double, triple-headed monsters going on at the USDA in terms of approving those claims. I'm going to talk about a case study with Smithfield a little bit later. But the minimal guidance they provide behind what free range is, has the option to go outdoors, doesn't really have to. Cage free, you could still be out of a cage. Most broilers are out of a cage, so that's sort of meaningless, truthful but meaningless. And fresh, so fresh for chicken, you can actually store that chicken to 26 degrees. And what does water freeze at? I know you're a lot of lawyers, but. Right, so it's 32 degrees. So 26 degrees, our California lobby office actually went bowling with chicken broilers to just prove the point with fresh labeled chicken broilers down the steps of the Capitol. So again, it wouldn't be that hard to fix it, you would think. I mean, it's just not that hard. It's not that far of a reach, and yet we sort of sit in this ridiculous, convoluted state, but we don't have to. Pure. I love that label because I've been duped by it too. I remember buying a product that was pure brie beeswax, but the first ingredient was mineral oil. And to that degree, you can have pure beeswax, I guess, on the front of the package, but that's not even what the whole thing was. So pure also gets sort of bastardized in the marketplace, and we definitely tell people they shouldn't rely on it. I just want to talk about, I know it's not food, but it's so enlightening. Clinique and Almay actually sued the FDA in the 70s over trying to create standards for what hypoallergenic should mean. And they won, and FDA was not allowed to set standards, but they didn't ban it. They didn't ban the term. So I see hypoallergenic on Clinique and Almay products all the time. So that's been going on for decades now. And really, again, they fought not to have the standards, and now they don't have to use any standards in order to use that claim. That kind of stuff really, we feel like, get rid of it. If you can't define it, and there are no standards for it, and it's not meaningful for consumers, just ban the label. Fragrance-free. It doesn't even have to mean it's free of a fragrance. And in fact, in a lot of body lotion tests we've done, we actually go through and we've found fragrances that actually are associated with some allergenic sensitivity in products labeled fragrance-free. So if we can't even define these very well, we're in a lot of trouble. And it shouldn't be acceptable to us. There are laws in place that can fix these things, and to the degree we get involved with that, I think we can move this landscape in a significant way. FTC just issued some guidance on what formaldehyde-free should be. If it has trace amounts of formaldehyde, it's okay. You can label it formaldehyde-free. That's crazy. We think if it says free, it should be free of it, not trace amounts of it. So all of these, few standards, very little verification going on. So there's really a lot of opportunities here to kind of dissect the science and the laws and the policies around this and really get to a better place. Okay, so we did a little bit more on free. Free, it isn't free. Trans fat free, it has less than half a gram of trans fat per serving. It doesn't mean it doesn't have partially hydrogenated oil, which is the main thing that imparts trans fats into processed foods. We think that's wrong. We think if it's going to say trans fat free, it should be that. And really interesting note, the CDC is actually very interested. Thomas Frieden came to Consumer Reports, and we had a really great discussion about where they're focused now in terms of public health. And one of the things is heart disease related to trans fat consumption. So you would think maybe the CDC and the FDA might get together and talk about labeling a little bit and whether we're being deceptive about that claim on the market, and is there more we could do to help people actually truly avoid trans fats instead of using that kind of standard behind that kind of claim. Allergen-free, a little bit similar, and it's a trickier one because there's so many trace allergens and everything, but to the degree it's not free of an allergen, we think it at least ought to represent that on the label, so that if you or someone in your family has serious allergies, you're able to make some good decisions, not based on trace levels, but based on whether it really has it or it doesn't have it. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about when we don't, won't, can't disclose. And genetic engineering is really one of them. So 62 countries around the world require foods that contain genetically modified materials to be labeled. And we talked a little bit about this at the beginning, but you know, Monsanto gets patents on all their genetically modified seed. And they get those patents because they can demonstrate the unique properties. It's unique, it's different than conventional. And so if it can get a patent, why in the world can't it be labeled? Why then is it not different when it comes to food and what it is, and is it different? It is different. They got a patent for it. They should have to label it for that as well. And 62 other countries actually agree with that. And survey after survey we do show more than 90% of consumers want to know if their foods contain genetically modified ingredients. Mad cow tested. So a couple years ago, when the first mad cow came out, Creekstone Farm Japan shut its borders to us, and Creekstone Farm wanted to start testing their meat, and they wanted to label it as tested for the mad cow prion. And when they went to USDA, to Food Safety Inspection Service, which is what they had to do to get the approval, they told them no. And they told them no because it would set a bad example, and people would think that their meat somehow had more value than conventional meat. And Creekstone Farm was shut down from actually doing that and putting that claim onto their label. That seems silly. That seems totally crazy that that would be allowed. Carbon monoxide treated. So anyone know why we use carbon monoxide in food? It's fun. It's to keep the ground meat looking red. So literally like you would get asphyxiated and turn red because carbon monoxide would bind to your hemoglobin, that's what it's doing in ground meat, keeps it nice and red in the store. When we tested those packages a couple of years ago, we found that there were actually more spoilage organisms on the meat packages that were treated with carbon monoxide, but you don't know if it's treated with carbon monoxide because it doesn't have to be labeled. And it doesn't have to be labeled because it's back to that, is it causing substantial transformation? I mean, I think if it binds to the hemoglobin, there's a chemical change, but okay, maybe that's not it. But wouldn't people want to know about it? It just seems crazy. And so to that degree, it is not required to be labeled. It is not considered something that is imparted to the food, but rather a gas in the package. And so it's not required to be labeled. It's one of these secondary food additives. It's a processing aid, and it's not required to be labeled on the package. There's a whole world of that going on out there that's not on the package. I want to talk about pink slime because I have a very specific point of view on it. So this is the bottom of the barrel. It's the bottom of the protein barrel. It's where you pull off the last bits of meat, you pull off the skin, you put it all into a centrifuge and you spin off the protein. The last, not all foods, beef has a standard of identity, and there are different standards of identity for each kind of cut quality of the meat, all the way down to lean, fine textured beef. That's the bottom. And that's what we've been calling this thing. Except part of that definition is that the product that you make does not have an odor, it has a fresh odor. But once you spin down trash from the animal, it doesn't have a fresh odor, and there's a lot of contaminants in it, and we actually have to raise the pH with ammonia to get that stuff to be clean. It has to be gassed to raise it 3 pH points with ammonia. So I don't know that it's even beef. I don't know that it's actually on the totem pole of even being beef. Beyond that, the use of ammonia in that product wasn't even required to be labeled. And there's a story about a prison that received a whole cube of pink slime. And when they opened up the frozen cube, the smell of ammonia was so bad, they thought they had gotten something terrible, that it was adulterated. They had no idea what it was. They went to the health department in the state. The health department said, oh, actually, yeah, there's ammonia in there. And, you know, the prison was like, my God, is that adulterated? Should we be eating this? The short of the story is they don't consider this to be a final product. And so that's why ammonia doesn't have to be labeled on here, because it's not considered a final product. You're to mix it in with your beef and augment it. And then once you do that, that diffuses the ammonia enough and think that it's not a significant residue in your final product, and therefore you don't need to know about it. There's a lot of problems with the labeling of pink slime and what it is. And I would just respectfully disagree. I don't think it's a safe product. I think we make it safe by gassing it with ammonia, but I actually don't think that product is a safe product. And I have a little line, when is trash just trash? You know, I think that that's, for us, what pink slime is. Country of origin labeling is really interesting, and Becky Goldberg brought it up today, and I have a little update, actually. So you heard about the challenge. Mexico and Canada sued the US at the WTO. This is about the mixed origin labeling. So a lot of meat in this country will be born in one country, raised maybe in Mexico or Canada, slaughtered in another, sold here. And to that degree, country of origin labeling laws require all the countries to be on there. Poll after poll we do with consumers show they want all of it. They want that labeling. They want to know where it's from. In fact, we got a call from the US trade rep before they went to argue this case, asking for any survey data that we could generate for them, and we actually did send some into the WTO. More than 90% of people want country of origin labeling. So Canada and Mexico won. It was viewed as protectionist and a trade barrier because, and it's a funny reason, because they were collecting so much information and they weren't using it all on the package. I mean, I think Canada and Mexico would just like the law to go away. And they'd actually just like it to say made in the US. That's what they would really like. But the esoteric reason for the ruling was you simply collect too much information, it's too taxing, it's too onerous, it's unfair, and so you shouldn't allow it. So a number of groups, us included, National Farmers Union, some strange bedfellows, actually proposed a different plan then, or an answer to this problem. And we actually met with the OMB last week and presented our positioning on this, which is, okay, the regulatory fix then should be put all that information on the label. Tell consumers that it was born in Mexico, that it was raised in the United States, it was slaughtered, and tell them everything. And today, the USDA has just announced that that's exactly what they're going to propose back to the WTO. So that's really exciting that we may have that regulatory fix. I'm sure Canada and Mexico are not going to be happy about that. And I don't know that the WTO will go for it, but it's a really interesting way to protect our laws, protect what our people want. And to the degree they think that's onerous, we'll take all the information on the package if that's the solution. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about organic because I think it's good, bad, and ugly all at the same time sometimes. Let's see, the Organic Food Production Act went into effect in 1990. It took 12 years, huge controversy. Sewage sludge was allowed, genetic engineering was allowed, there were all sorts of things. Generated over 275,000 comments in 1995. That was sort of before the big age of dinging your emails into the agency. And it was huge, and that groundswell actually led to changes and refinements in what that final law I'm sorry, what the final regs had to be. But the goal of the law was to impart consistency to that label. We had little organic shops all over the nation. They all meant slightly different things from one another. So the law was supposed to gather it all up and basically say, you know, we need consistency for consumers. So whenever they see this claim, no matter who certified it, it means the same thing. So the program was implemented in 2000, and 2002 is really when it rolled out into stores. The National Organic Standards Board is an advisory board that's set up for the National Organic Program. It has reps from the consumer sector, to the degree they fill that from the consumer sector, environmental, inspector, farmer, certifier. And there's 15 members. And what's really interesting about this board is that they have some statutory authority, actually, to approve materials that are appropriate for use in organic production. And so sometimes there are synthetic materials, which, you know, in the law, you're not supposed to use synthetics in organic. But there is a national list developed so that to the degree you need a 5-year use, you can put the material, you petition the material into this board. They will conduct a review of that material, safety, health, and determine whether or not they can make an allowance or make an exception for that for 5 years. And then it's supposed to sunset after 5 years. And I'll talk a little bit more about the problems with that in a minute. And then the USDA National Organic Program, it sits in the Agricultural Marketing Service, actually administrates the program and accredits certifiers. So these are really, they hold 2 public meetings a year. They're really fascinating, actually, and aggravating, but they are 3-day public meetings to talk about everything the National Organic Standards Board is going to propose. And it's at least a very transparent process, whether or not you agree with everything or not. And I'll just say, I think it's really important that everyone engage in that process, because to the degree we watchdog that label and make sure those standards remain high or go up over time, I think serves the market, the whole sustainable market. And I think if organic fails, whether you like it or not, whether you think it should be more or not, if that label actually fails, I think sustainable labels in the marketplace are in big trouble. And so I think if you're interested in sustainability and you're interested in food becoming more sustainable, you have to kind of get involved with organic one way or the other. I said there are 2 public meetings a year. Okay, so now here's where some problems start to come in. We start to create things like exemptions to the standards. So does anyone remember the pasture rule exemption and what happened there? Okay, so the organic program actually had a requirement in the regs that said livestock must have access to pasture. So, I mean, very commonsensical. They must have access to pasture. And yet, there were no other definitions of what it meant. So, certain companies, dairy companies especially, started exploiting that. And they literally had animals on dry lots being milked and labeled as organic. It was Horizon Milk, Aurora Dairy. They were both a big conventional dairy, and they started to get into organics. They got called out on it. It got taken up at the regulatory level. USDA eventually fixed that. There was also just a class action suit that just got settled recently, again, showing that this is what consumers expect. This is what the regulations actually required. You weren't meeting the regulations. And at least now we've worked with a number of different groups to get minimum requirements in there. So to the degree a producer doesn't understand what required pasture access is, there are at least some minimum baseline requirements. It's not as great as we'd like it, but there's something. So there's also this issue with sunset and getting those synthetic materials onto the national list. And for some reason, they don't sunset very easily. And the whole goal of that national list was so you put a material on, and then knowing that material is going to come off in 5 years, the industry would start to create alternatives. But what we've gotten bogged down in is a failure to actually retire these materials. And so we have researchers actually developing alternatives and organic alternatives. One is to a synthetic amino acid that's used in chicken feed called methionine. One farmer found a way for corn. There's a high methionine corn. There's an algae that makes methionine. And it found all these different ways, but they couldn't get it to a commercial point because they just kept relisting synthetic methionine on the national list. And so to that degree, they're in violation of their own authority. And to the degree we can hold them accountable for that, we can actually get better changes faster and start to prevent some of these exemptions that you see. The food contact substance exemption happened about 5 years ago. There was a blueberry farmer in Maine who sued the USDA, and he said, you know, your regs actually should be in line with your law that says no synthetics should be in the non-organic portion of organic. So organic means at least 95% organic. If it says 100%, that's what it means. And that 5% portion was really reserved for things like minerals, you know, things you can't really produce organically, but not for synthetic materials. And this blueberry farmer took them to task. And the court ruled that, yeah, the regulations were out of line with the law. So in the dark of night, Congress changed the law to bring it in line with the regs. And the result of that is that food contact substances and processing aids no longer have to be reviewed by the National Organic Standards Board. So whether it's nano packaging, whether it's BPA, whether it's the recent dairy phthalates, and all of it would have been reviewed had we not had that gut to the law that happened as a result of that lawsuit, and then really a response from Congress in a very dark of night way to change the law. I remember at the beginning of the implementation of the program, there were a lot of policy clarifications. We just want to clarify that we think antibiotics are allowed. Or we just want to clarify that we don't think animals need to eat 100% organic feed. We spent a lot of time calling them out in the media and get pretty fast changes that way too. The secretary at the time, Secretary Veneman, withdrew all 4 directives that her staff had done 30 days prior to that. And it only took 30 days to get her to withdraw those directives. So sometimes if you come down like a ton of bricks on them, they actually do something responsive. So there are a lot of misleading uses of the organic label. Remember, this is the Organic Food Production Act. So now we have personal care products labeled as organic. And they wanted to put aquaculture into the scope. We said, you know, a fish isn't a cow swimming in water. You actually need to develop standards for aquaculture. You know, either do it or don't do it, but don't do both. But that's kind of what went on. And so personal care products is a bit of a disastrous field. If you see the USDA organic seal, you know you're getting something. Anything else calling itself organic, you really need to do your homework to make sure that's what it is. We've actually filed complaints with the Federal Trade Commission saying we think there are a lot of deceptive uses of organic going on. And I'll tell you in a minute what the FTC's response was to us. Sewage sludge fertilizers, I want to talk about that for a minute. Sewage sludge, this is municipal solid waste from cities, is made into fertilizers and is used on food, fertilizer, crops. They give it away to cities, community gardens, and they market it as organic. And it is unbelievable because sewage sludge is actually prohibited in the National Organic Program. And yet, because it's not in the scope of the USDA says we can't really enforce against that, we can't really do anything, and nobody's doing anything. And this is an entire industry that has co-opted the organic claim when it's actually illegal to use their product in organic production. So that's really a piece of work. And then, you know, dry cleaners calling themselves organic, nobody's checking that. That has nothing to do with the Organic Foods Production Act. Oh, just to talk about aquaculture for just a second. So for a long time, they wanted to put aquaculture into the scope, so they did that. And then they convened all these task forces to start generating what should be the standards, what should be the guidelines. And then they said, but you know, in the meantime, if anyone wants to sell fish that has the organic claim in this country, go ahead. So our market was just flooded with Scottish salmon that was labeled organic. Maybe it was certified somewhere else, but we didn't know if it met our standards or not. They allow for antibiotics in Europe in their organic programs. But you and I could have stuck an organic claim on our fish and sold it wherever we wanted to. And we protested that USDA actually did have the purview. They had stuck it in their scope, so they actually should be regulating that. But for years they said, no, that's not what we're going to be doing. Finally, this past year, they finally started enforcement against that. And in the meantime, those standards are still being developed. And to the degree we are watchdogging those, I think that's one of the most important labels to watch in the next year or two for how we are going to define what an organic fish means in the market. The farmed salmon industry is all over this. They want to use less than 100% organic feed. They want to use open net pens in the ocean, which is like a toilet bowl flush. It's not a closed system where you're controlling inputs and outputs. And we don't think that should be allowed. And what's really sad about this is that that industry actually tied up the passage of decent standards 5 years ago when we could have gotten them out for, say, shrimp on the market, which can be raised that way and can, in fact, meet the organic standards. Imagine that, organic shrimp on this market. It's a huge value added for consumers. So hopefully we'll get there, but that's what's going to be happening in the next 2 years. We talked about delays. I want to talk about antibiotics on apples and pears. We're in a big fight over that, and at the next National Organic Standards Board meeting, it's going to happen. So did anyone think we could use antibiotics in organic production? No, nobody thought that. And it was granted as an exemption in 2000 on that national list. We're in 2014. And the apple and pear industry keeps petitioning streptomycin and tetracycline to spray on apple and pear trees to treat fire blight. It's a terrible disease. This entire industry is reliant on it. They have fire blight that is now resistant to the tetracyclines and the streptomycin. It's a disaster, and they're in a race to the bottom. This debate has finally started prompting alternatives research, but now we're having industry saying, please don't take this label away from us, because now we're researching and we're really trying and we have some value added. And this is, what we say is, we didn't do our job educating consumers about this then earlier, because to the degree people would know that, they would not support the fact that that has an organic claim. So that's a big fight that's taking place right now. We want that exemption stopped. And we want apple and pear producers who can produce their produce without antibiotics to be able to use the organic label and differentiate their products. So we're in that fight now. There's lots of tactics for resolutions when it comes to organic, whether it's petitioning them, whether it's introducing legislation in California, which we did, to ban the sale of organic fish until the federal government came up with standards. We do that. There's class action suits that we just talked about, and there's the media. And for us at Consumer Reports, it's a responsibility we take seriously, but it is also a very powerful way to get this information out there to people and to create the kind of demand for the better things we need for better policy changes. And so you can sue, and as Mike Jacobson says, it can take forever. There are sometimes other ways you can do that too, and it's exciting working at a place where you have that megaphone to do those things. Okay, so let's talk about Smithfield for a minute. And this was a fun little case in November 2012. We published in Consumer Reports our pork story. So we looked at pathogens, we looked at antibiotic resistance, and we talked about a number of the claims we found out there. And one of the claims we found out there was called no antibiotic growth promotants. And we called USDA and we said, did you approve this claim? And they said, no, that's not an approved claim. So we said, well, we're finding it on this farmland pork product and it's Smithfield. And so they said, you know what, please file a complaint with us. We'll follow up on that. So we did that. And in our November 2012 story, we basically reported that that label was not approved by USDA. And right before we went to press, we confirmed it again. They confirmed, yes, that wasn't an approved label. So we get this call from Smithfield after the article goes out, and they basically say, you need to retract that. And we were completely perplexed. We couldn't understand what had happened. So we called up the USDA again, and this time we got a totally different answer, that they had inadvertently approved the claim in January 2010. It was a mistake. But Smithfield had been using it for 3 years. And so they would send a letter to Smithfield, and thank you so much for letting them know about that. In January 2012, we issued a correction in the magazine basically saying that Smithfield had rightly used a wrong claim, that we were wrong, they had done it, they had gotten approved for it. Today, it is still being used. Just yesterday, we sit on USDA every week and ask them this. They won't actually share the letter with us that they sent to Smithfield. They say we have to FOIA for that. But they have just informed us now that Smithfield has till June 2013 to actually take that label off their package. So these things take time again, but in this case, we hope to get to a better place. Good, thank you. Okay, corn sugar, we talked a lot about this, so I'm not going to dwell on it too much, except to say that we also went to the FTC to talk about this change. So the corn refiners went to FDA. They petitioned to change the name of the ingredient from high fructose corn syrup to corn sugar. But as we've heard today, you don't squeeze corn sugar out of a plant. You get the dextrose. You have to actually synthetically change it into high fructose corn syrup. But in the meantime, they started advertising on their website and on TV about the neutrality of corn sugar and how that's all very nice. And so we went to the Federal Trade Commission and said, this is crazy. It's not a natural sugar. And the FTC finally ruled that that was not truthful, and there was already an identity for corn sugar. It was a crystalline dextrose out of the corn, that first product that's extracted. And so they denied it, and now FDA at least has finally denied that petition. And we think that's a good thing. There are safety questions about it. Nothing's conclusive in the science. In the meantime, people should at least be able to make an informed decision as to whether they want it or not. We talked a little bit about lawsuits going on around natural, and I don't want to dwell too much on that because I think we've talked about that enough, but really troublesome label. I want to just stop on this. This is the fractured state of the regulatory system. And so you can see FDA's got GE labeling, they have fish identity, they have the corn sugar ingredient petition, they do additives and labeling around that. USDA's got organic, they do country of origin labeling on fish. So not the FDA, but the USDA, and they do all the meat claims. And then you've got the Federal Trade Commission, green guides, the advertisements, and other unregulated misleading claims. So the rub is when we file complaints about any of these things going on in these agencies that we think are wrong, like sewage sludge being labeled as organic, FTC tells us, you know, that's not our purview. Since USDA is regulating that, we don't get involved. It's like ridiculous, it's my best friend, so I don't want to really get involved over there. It's crazy, and we get this response from them over and over again. We think it's crazy. We think that they have a job to do in helping our agencies get better at labeling. It should be that if we're spending taxpayer dollars to create these agencies to monitor these labels, at least put standards behind them or ban them, but make sure that consumers aren't being deceived by them in the marketplace. These are the cracks in between. Nobody regulates those because those are the cracks in between. You can help make it better. You can question what the meaning of popular labels. You can identify the conflicts of interest. You can identify the conflicts in the policy and the science. And use precedents from other labeling areas, too, to apply into this food. And we should be petitioning the hell out of the FTC to get these labels off the market. I'm going to leave you with a lesson from a Yale professor on how a label should never begin. So I attended a National Academy of Sciences meeting a few years ago on sustainable labels. And there was a large group of people. It was a roundtable discussion. And there was this professor from Yale. And he made a presentation about how he would go about designing a label out there. So here's what he had to say. He said what he would do is find out what 80% of the market can do in a given product sector and start the label there. That's where the standard should start. So that if 80% of that market could capture that label, it would be successful. And my response to him is we would tell people not to buy that label. That if your label that you're claiming is value added is on 80% of the products in the marketplace, Energy Star is a little bit like this, it isn't value added. And that doesn't help consumers, and that doesn't serve the marketplace. That just dilutes things further. So I'll leave you with that. I guess the last thing is, right, we don't want to start with the conventional baseline. We actually want to know what consumers want, where the value is added, and that's where a really good label should start. Thank you. Yeah.
So I'm aware that time's going on. Do we have sort of 10 minutes or so? Does anybody have a couple of questions? So I told you Urvashi was good. Everything you could think of.
Your microphone.
Hi, my name's Abby Horn, and I'm a Ph.D. student at MIT, and my work's on traceability in food, and mostly fresh produce. I don't know that much about meat, but you talked a lot about exemptions, but there's kind of so there's stuff that gets through, there's stuff that bends the law, and then there's just outright fraud. So kind of how, for the work that you do, how difficult is it to see where they fall in the three of these?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of organic, we know what's fraudulent out there in terms of organic. If it's not in the scope and there's no standards applied to it, it's really fraudulent. In something like hypoallergenic, there's nothing illegal companies are doing by using that claim. So for us, it's not about the company that's using it. It's about the agency that claims to regulate it but has no standards behind it. And that's where the spotlight needs to be to get that kind of systemic change in place. So it's really about camping those things in different places and really using different approaches, I think, to try and crack that. But to the degree we need to sort of bring the FTC into that fold for those things that are sort of legally allowed misleading uses of claims, I think we all need to get better involved with that. Okay, yeah.
Hi, Lorian Urban from the Tufts Friedman School of Nutrition Science and Policy. I have to admit I'm overwhelmed by all of the opportunities we have to label, and so it seems to me like we could include a package insert akin to the pharmaceutical package inserts that we're getting for all the labels that you're suggesting. So I'm just curious what your thoughts are on how to synthesize that information for the average consumer.
I mean, look, I think there are labels we need to get rid of. So I don't think we need to explain what natural is so much. I'd like to get rid of the natural label altogether. I think that there are things, though, consumers want to know about their products. And when we poll consumers, they tell us they want to know. They'll even pay more to know. And so to that degree, I understand there's a tension between let's not confuse consumers too much, but you have a consumer base that's very interested in that information. And so to the degree we need to maybe get better about design and communication, we need to. Our counterparts in Europe are much further ahead than we are. They label for GMOs. They have nutritional labeling in a sort of color-coded way. They're much further along the line than we are, and we could stand to learn from them. And maybe we need better designers at the agencies, I don't know, but it isn't a reason not to do it. It's just a matter of figuring out how best to do it.
Thanks so much, Urvashi. That was really enlightening, and I'm not sure what we can eat after listening to your presentation. I'm curious, I think one thing, I mean, this is sort of a tough question, but I'm curious, a lot of what we heard about today from your work and from Michael Jacobson and others was, addressing these things and sort of like finding a label that's misleading and then addressing that and going after it, and or even saying, this thing across the board shouldn't be included as organic. But it sounds like from the slide you showed with all the different agencies, because there's so many different elements and there's sort of, all these different issues going on, at the macro level, do you have any suggestions on kind of what can be done or kind of how we piece all of this together in some way that is a little bit more, that makes more sense to consumers and for food products? I'm sorry to ask you a tough question.
It is a tough question because I think it's almost, I think it's why we're all here talking about this. And I think to the degree we understand how fractured it is, ideally we think there should be one food agency. That's our position. I mean, it's so scattered across so many agencies, and then we have a Federal Trade Commission that doesn't want to get in if they've got their hand on it. So the balls are being dropped all over the place. I think what keeps me somewhat sane is that I don't work on all these issues all at the same time, but you have to sort of pick and choose, and then to the degree you can cut across all the different agencies, what they should be doing, what they're not doing, and kind of propose a plan. And I'll also say we work in coalition all the time. To the degree you can be in the room with an industry group that's showing it is feasible to do something in a better way. You're working with nonprofits, environmental groups. That broad dialogue has a lot of influence. And I didn't talk about some of the labels where we did kind of bring a multi-stakeholder group to the agencies and focus grouped with them over a year to sort of get better standards in place. But Those are all kind of elements that we all need to do. And so you're not only holding the bucket of water. I think to the degree, Emily, I want you to do the legal stuff and I'll do the science stuff and let's get in a room together and talk about it. I think we have to have a more cooperative and collaborative approach. Yeah.
Sorry. My source here is pretty pedestrian. My Facebook feed has been telling me that there's a lot of people interested in the fact that the food system requires labeling, expensive labeling for organic products, but not for things like GMO or for using pesticides. So I'm just wondering about the way that you're pushing the system is the way that I'd like the system to be pushed, but do you ever see a scenario where the thing gets flipped on its head and where people are required to spend a lot of money? Food producers are allowed to spend money to certify the other way. Am I making sense?
Yeah,
Okay.
I think you are. I mean, to the degree it costs more to get credible labels on these packages, that is a truth. To the degree it costs a lot more to be organic than it does to be conventional, that is the truth. So there is value added, and I think what we find from consumers is they're actually willing to pay for that. You know, in the Mad Cow Tested, we actually surveyed consumers and we estimated the cost. I think it was 5 cents a pound to get that testing. Overwhelming majority want it. So, you know, I think sometimes when we hear these debates, we hear about the outrageous cost it's going to. When trans fat-free label was being proposed, the industry fought hard against that. It was going to cost too much money. They didn't want to do that. They use it as a marketing claim now. So, you know, I think there are sometimes, it's a tactic to sort of say there's no possible way we can do that. It will simply cost too much money. But to the degree consumers are willing to pay a little bit more, to the degree that it doesn't cost the companies actually $1 gajillion in order to do that, we have to have a realistic discussion about those things. But to the degree consumers want it, you know, if everyone wanted blue M&Ms, we'd get blue M&Ms, and the response would be very quick, wouldn't it? So to the degree we're talking about these labels and wanting to know how our food is produced, it shouldn't be that much different if I'm willing to pay for it than if I want something as silly as a blue M&M and someone's going to label it for that.
Can we just take the last one and then wind it up?
Sure. I'm Louise Dennison. I work for Harvard Dining Services. And I have a question about large volume buyers. So you say that, you know, part of the meaning of a label is to raise the bottom, and that Consumer Reports wouldn't recommend a label that would work for only 80% of the market. Do you hold that true for large volume buyers also, or do you see a value in a label that might support some improvement in a practice for a large volume buyer?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So let me clarify a little bit about that. And let's go to those concentric circles again, right? No antibiotics used. Cover your ears, Andrew. So, you know, to the degree we can move the market incrementally to start using that label, we think that's a great thing. And to the degree the market wants to do that, that's a good thing. And if 80% of the market wanted to do that, that would be a good thing. But at some point, it's diminishing returns in terms of how much value that has. In terms of organic, if 80% of the market right now today could be labeled organic, it would have diminishing value than what it actually means. And so to that degree, there is a balance between making sure your label is truly value added, especially if you're charging more for it. I will say that Bon Appetit is a really interesting catering company that is trying to source things sustainably, and it's hard. It's hard work, but it is so meaningful that catering companies are doing that restaurants are doing that, because you are a mass consumer in some ways. And so to the degree 80% of your chicken would be animal welfare approved, that's a great thing. So I don't want you to misinterpret that 80% that way. I think that would be a great thing. But I think to the degree that if you're going to ask consumers to pay more because they think they're getting something that's much more valuable, it can't be that the whole market gets that label. Okay. Thank you. Thanks.